Behind the Door, Part 3, Chapter 11. A little before, for the few moments I'd been there, the bedroom of Cattolica's parents had seemed steeped in total darkness. I was wrong. Once there, again, I quickly realized that one could see more than enough. In the room I'd just left, they had turned on the table lamp. Seeping through the gap of the half-closed door, the light was a white band which extended sharply past my feet, across the floor of dark hexagonal tiles identical to those on the ground floor, without encountering a single object. The very faint light, that of an underground crypt, which spread uniformly across the room, was produced by a tiny, low, dim lamp beneath a holy image hung in the center of the wall to my right. It was enough to disclose the parallel shapes of two separate beds, side by side, and the blackish shadow of a dressing table and a wardrobe beside the image itself, which was of a Jesus with languid blue eyes and a blonde helmet of hair perfectly parted in the middle, with vermilion lips barely parted to disclose the tips of two snow-white teeth, and with one alabaster feminine hand raised limply to point at a plump red heart that hung like a monstrous fruit high on his chest. I was tense, alert, but calm. I focused on the image of Jesus, that extravagant red heart, and also on my own, which from the first had been beating furiously, but had now steadied itself. Besides, I was no longer there in the study, a few yards from Cattolica and Luciano, who, after having slowly climbed the stairs, were still lingering to chat in the anteroom. The bedroom where I had hidden myself appeared to me at once as an infinitely more secret, more remote, even more shadowy place than it actually was. A speck lost in the womb of a vast space, wide as the ocean. Once the four of them were seated around the table, Luciano, I guessed, occupying the place where, till just before, I myself had sat, I wondered when and in what way they would get round to talking about me. They had some 2 hours at their disposal, and perhaps for this reason too, apart from enjoying keeping me in suspense, Cattolica seemed unconcerned to hurry things along. Patient and sly as a cat with a mouse, he listened to his prey dispensing his fluent, typically Bolognese character. Pulga was speaking about trivial enough things. He too was stalling. And so, Cattolica had the air of saying, though remaining almost entirely silent, and so? Let the little toad keep blathering. Let him do his utmost to appear amusing and intriguing in exchange for the inestimable gift of being invited and accepted there. Sooner or later, from the tone of his sparse replies, of his measured interruptions to the ceaseless hum of Luciano's voice, I understood how sure of himself Cattolica felt. He would do to him exactly what we had all, myself included, agreed to do. So for a long time, for a good half hour, Luciano spoke of things that related to me only indirectly. He began speaking about their homework. He asked if they'd finished it. And since Cattolica answered in the affirmative that they'd completed it just now, moment before he'd arrived. Oh, well, he sighed, lucky them. He, by contrast, hadn't managed to get through more than a fraction. The Latin and Italian he'd done, but not any Greek yet. No, really, but thanks a lot, he had then exclaimed, allowing me almost to see the rapid lateral shift of his jaw. It wasn't necessary for Cattolica to lend him his exercise book, apart from the fact that every now and then he'd like trying to do it on his own. That is, translating the 98 verses of the Iliad assigned us by that crabby old Guzzo. He still had the whole evening after supper and tomorrow morning to finish it. From homework, he changed the subject to philosophy. Razzetti had yet to quiz him in class, he said, and so tomorrow morning, when he'd finished working on the Iliad, he certainly needed to take a look at the Phaedo, as one could never be sure. And speaking of which, Razzetti, sure enough, philosophy wasn't his forte, and he could only teach it by way of the usual smoke and mirrors, relying on those synopses he always resorted to in his history classes. But Plato himself, wasn't he anyway every bit as dull as poor old Razzetti? And Socrates, always holding forth with his smug, know-all-teacher's air, and yet as stupid as they come, an utter fool. Just as well that at the end, he'd skipped ahead, they'd given him that famous cup of hemlock to drink. But even leaving aside Plato and Socrates, in his modest opinion, the whole of philosophy was a load of crap. What do you mean? Objected Cattolica. It's not as though philosophy is religion. There's no need for you to believe in it. Excuse my ignorance, but what is it then? Slowly, good-naturedly, indulgently, Cattolica began to expound his thoughts on philosophy. Grassi and even Boldini also chipped in every now and then. I dare say all of you were right, Luciano sighed at a certain point. All the same, he added, with what little grey matter that, after so much cranking the shank, he had left at his disposal. Who knows what low marks he'd get tomorrow morning should it occur to Razzetti to test him. He was no Cattolica, unfortunately, someone who only needed to read something once to understand it. Of little intelligence as he knew himself to be, with only the faintest glimmer of a memory. But going back to Phaedo, it seemed to him, as he'd already said, nothing more than worthless blather. And yet there was one theory in it, while probably a load of rubbish, which nevertheless had somewhat convinced him. I'll bet that was the theory of metempsychosis, Cattolica interposed. How did you guess? Cattolica replied that if there was one thing in Phaedo which he himself could give no credence to, it was precisely the theory of the transmigration of souls from men to animals and vice versa. To believe in that, you'd have to dispose of the whole Catholic religion. And he, as a good Catholic, believed in hell, purgatory, and heaven. I wouldn't argue with that, Luciano replied contritely, even though I feel there's an element of truth in metempsychosis. Listen, he went on. Take Guzzo, for example. Most likely before being born with 2 legs and arms, he'd have been a poisonous snake, an adder, or a cobra, take your pick, and would revert to that as soon as, God willing, he breathes his last. And Kraus, who, perched up there in her cupboard among her retorts and alembics, gives herself the grand air of being a wise owl, or maybe she used to be a duck instead. You just had to look at her backside. Old Half-Pint, who knows, maybe he used to be an earthworm, the kind you find by the bucket load when you're out in the country, and give a clod of mud a kick. Tiny, it's true, but lovely and fat and pink. And moving down the scale to our classmates, it's more than probable that Mazzanti was a rat. Only you'd have to decide whether he was a country rat, a cellar rat, or a sewer rat. Chierigatti, a pack mule. Lattuga, a pig, obviously, and perhaps a hyena as well, since hyenas feed on corpses dug up in cemeteries, and they stink even worse than pigs. Donadio, a guinea pig. Camurri, a blind mole. Droghetti, with that nose of his, a camel. Selmi, a horse, more of a cart horse though. Veronese and Danieli, poor things, two donkeys with their dicks always dangling, and so on. So, just supposing for the moment that metempsychosis isn't the nonsense it may well be, all of them would in time revert to their original forms, with the exception of Lattuga, who, retaining his identity, would be reborn as a worm, of the sort that squirms about in the intestines. Here, he broke into dialect, up to its oxters in shite. And also accepting Mazzanti, who instead of being reborn as a rat, even if it was a sewer rat, there's every reason to suppose that he'll find himself turned into a louse, trudging his way through someone's pubes. You've forgotten the girls, Cattolica observed. They don't count. Haven't you seen them all? Where do you think they all come from? Obviously all of them were geese or hens. I heard him snigger. He sounded all fired up and very pleased with himself. And me? Cattolica persisted. What might I have descended from, in your opinion? Go on. Don't be shy. I don't know, perhaps from a bird, a falcon of the alpine variety, or a sparrowhawk, or even an eagle, that over the others, he recited Dante through his nose, like an eagle flies. Oh, yeah? And Boldini? Give me a moment. He could have been a jaguar or an elephant, seal. Well, you, Grassi, do you know what you used to be? You were a beaver, one of those beasts with two big front teeth, always paddling around, constructing dams. Anyway, he went on, he was of the same opinion as Plato, that there were very few men and women indeed whom, when they were reborn, would manage not to regress. He himself had perhaps been a dog, and would always return as a dog, unless, like Mazzanti and Lattuga, he had to descend a great deal lower. For some moments, they remained perfectly silent. So, to sum up, Cattolica finally responded, Lattuga's a tapeworm, Mazzanti's a pubic louse. And you? We'll have to wait and see. He then said that if he had to choose what type of parasite he'd be reincarnated as, he'd almost prefer to descend to the very lowest point, and rather than be a flea or a tick, to be reborn as a microbe. That would be reincarnation with real privileges. No worries as far as food and drink went, guaranteed invisibility, a real godsend all considered. Responsibilities? Nothing apart from making modest claims, avoiding the behavior of certain microbes, like those of typhoid, rabies, tetanus, pneumonia, and so on. Those that gloat because in a few days they've ruined everything. Rather than that, it was much more sensible to model one's behavior on those microbes of a better character, who, once they found a quiet little dwelling, stay there happily eating away for 20, 30, 40 years, and at the final reckoning don't really annoy anyone. The syphilis bacillus, or those of certain kinds of tuberculosis, those are the proper gents with brains, able to live and let live. His father always said the same. He sniggered again. The others didn't breathe a word. And it was just at this point that Cattolica pronounced my name. It was as if it didn't belong to me, as if it belonged to some unknown person. Fair enough, he added. Let's suppose that you're a dog. How about him? Another dog, he replied without hesitation. No doubt about it. With this difference, he went on, that while he himself had once been, he'd bet on it, one of those small, worthless mongrels, always trotting about the streets in search of questionable matter to sniff, turds, dog piss, etc. I, by contrast, must once have been one of those big dogs, far from thoroughbred, but still quite a fine crossbreed, one it's always fairly easy to find a good home for. That's it, a big dog, but not one of the very biggest, good-looking, not a beauty, strong but not that strong, one of those dogs that when they meet a mongrel of the pulga type, weighing a mere couple of kilos and only a palm or so high, often it falls out that it's the mongrel who drags the other dog along with him wherever he wants to go. And it's not by any means always the case that the fine big dog isn't the one sniffing the other's arse. Quite the contrary. Chapter 12. When they'd finished laughing, all four of them had burst out laughing, Cattolica included. The conversation continued. Now it was about me that they spoke, and, as before, it was the voices of Luciano and Cattolica that were heard above the others. What were they saying? Cattolica was asking Luciano how he'd managed to get rid of me. And Luciano replied to him that everything had been as easy as pie. It was I who had announced that I was busy that afternoon. I had a very sore throat, I said, and though perhaps that was a lie, and had to go for an appointment with my uncle, who was a doctor. A lie? Cattolica asked quietly. And why would that be? Who can say? He's not that easy to figure out. He seems naive, and yet he's so complicated and suspicious. He takes offence over trifles. Unfortunately, he continued. Between the three of them and me, there wasn't the best of relations. And no one knew that better than him, who, caught between enemy lines, had had to work so hard at reconciliation. But on this subject, what had actually happened between us to justify my rancour towards them? What had they actually done to me? He knew, didn't he, just what weird quirks of character to expect from a Jew. But that much anger? That really surprises me, Cattolica replied. I've never had anything against him, and nor have those two. Do you know what I think it is? Tell us. I think, Luciano resumed, lowering his voice, that he's irked most of all by the fact that he'd like to be your friend, to come round here as well, while instead, and here he sniggered, he's been left in the lurch. I think you're wrong about that, said Cattolica with a flicker of impatience. First of all, we're the best of friends. Otherwise, I'd like to know why on earth we would have kept on sharing the same desk for so many months. And secondly, if, as you say, he was so keen to come round to study at my house, why has he never asked me? He could very well ask me, don't you think? Oh, of course he could, Luciano exclaimed. Only, if you'll let me explain, it was him that had to ask you what pleasure would he have got from that. Don't you see? And I know him well enough to know what I'm saying. He wanted, above all, for you to invite him. And since you weren't ever inclined to... From the sound of a chair being shifted, I gathered that Cattolica had stood up. Muffled by the carpet, his footsteps suddenly resounded on the bare wood of the ring, then once more became deadened. Perhaps he'd gone to sit on the bed at the far end of the room, or even stretched out on it. But what has he done to you? He said at last from down there, that you always speak so ill of him. Luciano, too, got up from his seat. Most likely he'd felt the need to be nearer Cattolica, and to confirm it when he spoke, his voice sounded further off, different. He said that it was true that basically he couldn't stand me, but not so much because he found me disagreeable or because I'd behaved badly towards him. If he criticised me, he did so for much more serious reasons than merely because we were incompatible characters, or out of any trivial, childish, hysterical spite. He was mature enough to suppress any reaction of that kind. But for this very reason, because he was above any such pettiness, not even a sense of gratitude would stop him from saying with objectivity whatever he thought was right and useful to say about me. For example, to start off with, my vanity, my incredible, absurd vanity, that of a child in kindergarten. He'd perceived this straight away, right from the start. Have you ever been to his house? He asked. No, Cattolica replied. I never go round to other people's houses. It's a principle of mine. Well, Luciana went on, it's a real palatial spread, as big as 4 or 5 normal houses stuck together and endowed with a magnificent garden besides. My family, on its own, had reserved the whole 2nd floor for itself, an apartment of some 20 or so rooms. Who knows the cost of heating it? We were basically made of money, and you could see it. But a gentleman is a gentleman, and a profiteer is something else. Our wealth didn't date back to an earlier era than that of my paternal grandfather, a wholesale textile merchant. That was something I confirmed for him on the first day, when, without giving him time to catch his breath, I'd taken him on a room-by-room tour of the whole place. I had immediately shown him everything. The salon for parties, the 3 drawing rooms, the 2 dining rooms, the 7 bedrooms, the 4 bathrooms, the so-called office, and even the toilets, one for the owners and one for the servants. And all the time I looked smug and complacent, disgustingly pleased with myself. On every door frame, my grandfather, who, as I'd told him, was very religious, had attached certain small rods made of nickel, about the size of a 50 centesimo piece, each of which had a little piece of paper with writing in Hebrew rolled up inside it. He'd asked me for some explanation about this, and you should have seen my face as I expounded on the minutiae of the meaning and function of those gadgets. I was blushing with pleasure. What was written inside those rods? Nothing. The name of God the Father, and that's it. Such was my vanity that I even transformed our religion into a personal or a family achievement. Our God, I'd used those very words, is the eternal God, the one and only. In my opinion, Christianity should be seen as a more modern version of Judaism. And so it may be. But as I went on about him, my old man with a beard, I assumed the same triumphal air with which I might swank about that good old salt, my grandpa, the canny wholesale cloth merchant. We'd started studying every day in tandem, but even here I showed a conspicuous desire to show off, to be in the lead. Everything became a spur to competition for me. At home as much as at school, I behaved as if I was perpetually in a football match, which was enough to induce anybody close to me to let me forge ahead and win, and be done with it. It was quite true that, scholastically speaking, for months he lived in my shadow, transformed by me into a kind of parasite, a hermit crab. But hold on, the hermit crab is a poor crustacean, about whom it's fair to say it gratefully proffers its backside. But a classmate, even if from a less well-off family, even if less intelligent and knowledgeable, even if the end not at all unhappy to have found somebody prepared to do the work for him, is still a classmate, which is to say a human being. I had never considered him either a human being or a friend, and that was the truth. His only purpose had been as a machine for doling out praise, working with the same detachment as turning on a tap. He'd barely even seen my brother and sister. The brother was still in the second form of lower school, and the girl, the youngest, was only in the third form of primary school. But he'd certainly had the chance to see my parents up close, particularly my mother. Have you ever had a look at her? Who? His mother? No. And that's a shame, because as women go, she's certainly worth the effort. She was a lady of around 33, he went on, maybe a bit brassy, as Jewesses always are, but with a stunning mouth, with big brown eyes which send out some very particular looks. Although she was dark-eyed and dark-haired, it was mainly her that I looked like. And in the same way that I, vain and in constant need of praise, made use of him as a vaulting horse to measure the strength of my muscles, his mother too had made use of him as the best means to ensure that her nice little boy stayed safely home till supper time. She'd be capable of any sly tricks, that gracious dame, just to achieve this worthy end. She would turn up with huge trays that would have kept hunger at bay for a whole family for 2 days. Coffee and milk, tea, hot chocolate, whipped cream, pastry, little cakes, petit four, chocolate sweets every afternoon, a complete panoply. But this was nothing, because apart from that air she always had, the hussy, while filling your cup or putting cakes under your nose. Go on, don't be polite, she presses you in her insinuating way. Sweets and nourishing, they build up the muscles and the mind. She never failed, afterwards taking her leave, to cast back through the half-closed door a look that was half maternal and half femme fatale. And the kisses that so close up she would often plant on the cheeks of her good little son, all beaming with joy to see that he was there, within the warm glow of the radiators, so hard-working, so handsome and clever. What kisses! One evening last winter, when there was a storm, she went a bit further. To persuade him to stay for supper, and perhaps even to sleep there overnight, she suddenly began to stare at him, looking into his eyes so intensely that it would have put the frighteners, not just on him, whom it didn't take much to scare, but the very devil. What was she promising with that look? That's enough. He'd better stop there. One thing was for sure, that in the summer at the seaside, we'd be going to Cesenatico. Take note, a woman like that, what wouldn't she get up to during the week when her feeble old husband would have to return to the city to sort out his affairs, leaving her in the rented villa with no other company than the servants and the children? With those big fleshy lips, with those languid eyes half hidden by her hair. Her breasts had sagged a bit, true, but the undercarriage was perhaps worth a visit all on its own. There was no way that, given the chance, he'd let her escape. But going back to me, could they believe that I didn't even know what jacking off was? To tell the truth, he'd always suspected it. And yet on the occasion when cornered, I'd had the courage to admit that I'd never done it, he was gobsmacked. At 16, and giving himself such airs as well. "Let's start with having a look at it," he'd said. After much prevarication, he got me to show him my dick, which, although a roundhead from circumcision, had seemed to him utterly normal and average. Yet there had been another event which had seemed to him pretty symptomatic, and that was my reaction when, a bit before, to convince me to unbutton, he'd had the idea of unbuttoning himself. Well, I went so pale at seeing his dick, and then in the following days my manner of behaving was so changed. I became surly and rude all at once. My eyes were shifty, as if he had disgusted me, or, I don't know, made me angry, that he couldn't but think the worst. Indeed, I was undoubtedly a faggot, though perhaps in a latent state, only waiting for the bell to ring before I crossed over, and as yet still ignorant, this being the tragic thing of the lovely career that would inevitably open before me. Chapter 13. On tiptoe, slowly leaving the shadow for the light, I moved towards the large glass door that separated the sitting room from the dining room. My family was having supper. Seated with her back to me, my mother was wearing a light dress of white linen that left her neck, back, and arms bare. Around the table were my father, my brother Ernesto, my sister Fanny. I looked at each of them, one after the other, as if they were strangers. An odd memory block hindered me from remembering my mother's face, which was hidden from me. Was he my father? I wondered. That poor old man in slippers and pyjama top, who was just finishing up his bowl of soup. Were they my siblings, those two little children with such a grave and solemn air, who within seconds would burst out laughing? And the lady with her back to me, the beautiful woman with dark hair, haloed with light, her left hand, which, when she lifted it to wave it about, was glinting with rings. Was she really my mother? And was it possible that I myself was the son of that mediocrity of a man, both bored and boring, unable to contain himself, especially at home, to act in a dignified fashion, and of that woman who seemed so common, and that precisely to that union, that physical union, I owned my existence? The maid arrived carrying the plates of meat and vegetables, and suddenly, from the expression between surprise and fear which her face assumed, I realized that my presence had been registered. "It's the young sir," she exclaimed. I had no other option. I pushed down on the door handle, went in, and sat at my place beside my mother. "But dear, it's 9:30. My mother broke the silence around the table, smiling. "Where have you been?" She was looking at my face, my hands, checking everything, and through her fearful glances, worried and at the same time collusive, I understood how far she was an involved participant in the atrocious wound that had been dealt with me such a short time ago. Who knows? Perhaps by mysterious means, she too had suffered at the exact same moment that I had. I replied that I'd been round at a friend's house. At Catholica's? Yes. You two now have become inseparable. I wonder what Pulga has to say about that. Was he there too? What a way to behave, my father intervened in an indignant tone. You could have phoned, surely. It would cost you nothing, no effort at all. Yes, Pulga was there, I murmured, without lifting my eyes from the empty soup bowl. My father opened his mouth, but a furtive gesture of my mother's ring-laden hand was at the ready to hush him. Would you like some cold soup? She asked me. I nodded. But I wasn't hungry. I ate slowly with half spoonfuls, feeling as if my stomach would reject the food. I imagined myself back in the bedroom of Catholica's parents, my shoulders pressed against the wall, and my eyes fixed on the Jesus with that red heart, and could still hear the calm, indefatigable hum of Luciano's voice against the partition. No, I didn't step out, I didn't make an appearance. After I heard Luciano say with a laugh, "Such prodigious efforts to learn all that Latin and Greek, and what chance does he have of any career but that one?" I finally shook myself, stepped away from the wall, crossed the room, and walked out into the anteroom. In the thick darkness, I went down the stairs, found my bike in the small dining room, and then in the open air began pedalling rapidly with my head down. Via Cittadella, via le Cavour, Corso della Gioica, onward, without ever stopping, as if down a straight, endless, dark tunnel. Aren't you hungry, darling? I shook my head. He'll have eaten something, my father grumbled. I got to my feet. I feel a bit sick. Best if I don't eat supper. What have you been eating? My father pressed the point. Ice cream. I haven't eaten a thing. I stared at him coldly, with hatred. Calm down, he responded, intimidated. Did you get out of bed on the wrong side? Good night. Without giving either him or my mother the customary good night kiss on the cheek, I quickly left the room. As soon as I was in my bedroom, I stripped, got between the sheets, turned off the light, and closed my eyes. I remained like that for some 10 minutes. I couldn't sleep. I was about to get up and dressed again when I heard my mother's steps in the corridor. She stopped before the door. I heard her call me in a low voice. and then felt the room fill with her presence. What a bore, I thought to myself in fury, pretending to be asleep. I felt her beside me, tall and silent, above my outstretched body. I wanted to get up, insult her, slap her, and chase her away. But then, as cool, as fresh, and light as ever, I felt her hand descend through the dark to touch my forehead and rest there. That alone sufficed. Nothing else was needed for me. Just a little later, alone again, to fall asleep. To fall once again into the deep, curative sleep of a child. The next morning, entering the classroom, I saw at once that everyone was there, seated at their own desks. Luciano quickly greeted me with a smile and with a festive wave. But from Boldini's and Grassi's behaviour, leaning over an exercise book they had between them, and that of Cattolica in particular, whose gaze, as I drew closer to him, didn't leave my face for a second, it was clear to me that even they realized the irreparable gravity of what had happened the evening before. Cattolica waited till I sat down and didn't even greet me. He merely gave me a faint grin. I knew him well enough to understand that he felt lost and worried. But why, I wondered? What was making him walk on eggshells? Was it perhaps the hope that I hadn't stayed to the bitter end and so hadn't heard the worst? It could have been that. In any case, if that had been his hope, I would soon strip away any illusion he was under. Everything was over between us, over forever. And he should understand that as soon as possible. He covered his mouth with his hand. "You did the right thing to leave," he said. "It really wasn't worth your trouble knowing." I lowered my head in assent and didn't reply. He sighed. "He's crazy. He's a poor fool who can't control himself. Leave me alone and stop bothering me." Guzzo was at the teacher's desk. I had spoken without troubling to cover my mouth and was immediately aware the teacher was scrutinizing me. "Are we at it again?" he said threateningly. As though inspired, I leapt to my feet and stared him in the face. "Excuse me," I said, "but could I ask you to let me change places?" "And why ever should I do that, my dear fellow? Have you perhaps forgotten that there are fewer than 10 days before the end of term?" "I know, but it's precisely because of that I want to change places. Here, with him," I nodded towards Cattolica. It always ends up with us continually distracting each other." My words were received with a prolonged whisper of consternation and disapproval. "May I ask you all to stay absolutely silent?" Guzzo shouted. He had the air of not believing what was happening. But there I was, in front of him, standing rigid and straight, determined to get what I was asking for. He looked around, bewildered. "And to what desk would you like to be transferred? It doesn't look to me as if any are available." "I'd like to go again to the back of the class," pointing at Luciano's desk without turning round, "where Pulga is, but on my own." "And Signor Pulga?" "Pulga can easily come and sit here." "I see. You were proposing a double transfer," Guzzo exclaimed in amusement. "Do ut des. Very well, I shall permit it. Have you been following Luciano Pulga? Up, shift, get a move on. Assemble your splendid chattels and betake yourself up here beside the great Cattolica, who, I'm sure, will be honoured." And while Luciano, laden with his books, went past me along the aisle between the second and the third row of desks, brushing against me, he gave me a look full of bafflement and fear, a dry, imperious, sibilant shf served to strangle a fresh crop of murmuring at birth. To return to the complete solitude of the preceding autumn, I had still to manage one further step, to break with Luciano. Yet, at midday after the end of school bell, when I noticed him walking all alone along the pavement of Via Borgoleone in front of me, painfully at a tilt because of the pile of books he carried, balanced on his angular hip, I felt a moment of hesitation. It was true I had treated him harshly and coldly all that morning in class, and yet, how come now I hadn't foreseen this? I even felt I could surmise from the speed of his steps, from the neat precision with which he set down one foot after the other, that he'd guessed everything and wanted to flee. And if he did, all the better. "Hey," I cried out. "Wait up." He stopped with a jolt and turned his head back. He was very composed, the corners of his thin lips raised in a smile tinged with a slightly woeful benevolence. "Oh, it's you." We walked on side by side. He said nothing to me, making no reproach, and this began to disconcert me. Where the street met Corso della Gioveca, I crossed over determinedly, leaving him some yards behind. He caught up with me on the opposite pavement. "What's wrong?" he asked in confusion. "Aren't you going home?" I replied that I was fed up with always taking the same route along the same streets. Today I wanted to walk with him part way to his house. It was a Friday, market day. Corso Roma and the cathedral square were thronged with farm workers. We made our way through with difficulty, occasionally losing one another in the bustle, still without speaking a word. He hasn't understood, I thought. If I were only to let him at 4:00, there he'd be, sitting beside me at my table. Before the turning for Porta, right under the clock tower on the square, I stopped. Goodbye, I said. He swallowed, then murmured, Bye. Pale as a corpse, he stared at me, the bum fluff on his upper lip damp with sweat, and his Adam's apple in nervous agitation. We'll see each other later today, he risked. I don't think so. Are you busy? Just my homework, that's all. What's wrong with you? Nothing. And you? He widened his blue eyes. Me? But I'd already turned my back on him. Chapter 14. The very morning when, in the vestibule of the Guarini school, the marks for the end of year were due to be posted, Otello Forti phoned me. He had arrived back the evening before, he told me. He had finished his last oral exams at 5:30 in the afternoon, just in time to return to college, pack his suitcase, and run to catch the train that left from Padova at 7. I asked him how he'd done. Quite well, I'd say. And you? I replied that I didn't know, that I was just then leaving to check the marks. Well, why not stop back at mine? He suggested. If you'd like, we could go along together. He was friendly, talkative, even, having acquired a light trace of a Veneto accent. But even towards him, I now felt only indifference. Why don't you stop back at mine and pick me up? I said. He tried to argue. He said that as his house was halfway between mine and the Guarini, it seemed to him more logical that I should come round to his. And he was already less friendly, already en route to adapting his ever-grumbling, despotic persona, always ready when he got it into his head to obtain something, to throw himself into the most stubborn arguments. Fine, listen, I cut him short. Let's meet in front of the main entrance of the Guarini in half an hour. Would that suit you? All right. Naturally, I'd passed, with 8s in all literary subjects, and with 2 6s in science and in maths and physics. But where was I placed? First, second, third. It was 11:30. In the big vestibule, there was no one but ourselves. Otello only needed a glance to work out that battling for first place were me, Cattolica, and Grassi. Sure, against my 8 in Italian, Cattolica could only boast of a 7, and Grassi a mere 6. But Cattolica had an 8th in maths and physics, and Grassi a 9 in science. You must be second, he concluded, behind Cattolica by 1 mark. Grassi's third, also just by 1 mark. Unusually solicitous and helpful, he took a pencil from his pocket and began writing on the wall between the lists. Luciano had passed, I noted in the meantime. All sixes, but a pass just the same. I was right, Otello announced at last with a flourish of triumph in his voice. Cattolica first, and you second. We went out into the open air. Aren't you going to phone home? I said it wasn't worth the trouble. With one hand on the bicycle saddle, the other on the handlebars, I looked him up and down. If at Christmas he had seemed so much taller and more grown up than me, now he appeared small, a kind of child. Do you want me to take you on the bike back to your house? I proposed. Go on, get on the crossbar. And in fact, like a child, he obeyed immediately. Despite the weight, the encumbrance, and the cobblestones of Via Mascaraio, I pedalled fast. I looked at the back of Otello's neck. Beneath his blonde hair, cut short, I could make out the plump, pink, tender skin. I breathed in the odour of good soap that he gave off, and remembered by contrast Luciano's scrawny neck, greasy with brilliantine, his big, pale, translucent, wafery ears, a bit like an old man's. I hadn't carried Luciano on the crossbar of my bike more than 2 or 3 times in all. Otello, hundreds. And yet I understood now that there was no remedy. Even if I had forced myself to re-establish my old relationships with Otello, as we were at primary and then at lower school, beneath his good, honest smell, I would always sense the other, that revolting, oppressive reek of brilliantine. As if he too had intuited that in the future we would only see each other rarely, and that from now on the clock of our friendship was ticking away. Otello didn't stop talking for a moment. He pumped me for all kinds of information, who I'd shared a desk with during these months, whose house I'd gone to study with, who I'd become friends with. And I answered him sketchily, referring to Cattolica and to Luciano, but without informing him of anything else. His back was there in front of me, stocky and childlike. To confide in him. I felt as if I was facing a huge, steep, impervious mountain. The very idea of having to scale such a mountain of obtuseness was enough to fill me with nausea and powerlessness. Luciano Pulga? Asked Otello. So who would he be? He's not from around here. No. Where? I explained. And what's he like? How does he do at school? He gets by. Did he pass? Yes. All his marks 6s. On the topic of Cattolica, I was less laconic. I told how it came about that we shared a desk. I even said that despite sitting next to each other, we'd never really become friends. If nothing else, he has to be clever, Otello observed at this point. Did you see how many 8s he managed? We'd arrived. I braked, put one foot on the ground, and swiftly, as soon as I'd dismounted, Otello looked me in the eyes. Come in for a moment. I replied that I couldn't, that I had to be going, and saying so, I pressed down on the pedals and left him. In 5 minutes I'd reached my house, and having passed through the street entrance, I immediately saw my mother seated in the garden under the magnolia. The sudden change from the heat outside to the cool of the entrance made me sneeze. I saw her raise her head. If I'd gone up to my room by crossing the garden, I thought, I would have had to stop to talk. It was just midday. We had plenty of time. And yet what would we have had to talk about? I sneezed again and blew my nose. From the depths of the entrance, with my bike resting on my hip, I watched my mother, half closing her eyes. Immersed in the sun-speckled shade which gathered around the base of the magnolia, she was nothing but a remote, brightly lit spot. She raised her arm. "Ooh!" she cried out, modulating her lovely singer's voice in her preferred call. I disappeared to the side to put my bike in its usual place under the stairs, turned back, and said that I had to rush off to make a phone call. "Did you pass?" "Yes." "What were your marks?" "I have to make a phone call," I repeated. Upstairs, I passed through one room after another until I reached my bedroom. I had only just entered when I heard my mother's voice resound once again. She was now talking to the cook, who was leaning out of the office window. When I had finished on the phone, she was saying, "Please ask him to come down here for a moment." And as the cook replied that I wasn't in fact on the phone, but she thought I was in my room, my mother began to call me again. She called out my name 2 or 3 times, lingering melodiously on the vowels. Between one call and the next, I heard her grumbling. I lifted the blinds. "I'm here." "Will you or won't you, strange fellow that you are, honour us by coming down here for a moment? Go on, hurry up, and do as you're told." She wasn't annoyed, far from it, not even impatient. At the heart of her realm, centre stage, surrounded by her blessed creatures, the poodle, Lulu, the 2 smoke-coloured Persian cats, and the tortoise, Philomena, she watched me and smiled. She was sewing the hem of a sheet or a tablecloth. The needle glinted on her lap. The garden, lush as a little jungle, glowed around her. I got all 8s, I said, except from Signora Kraus and Signora Fabiana. 6 in science and 6 in physics and maths. Well done, darling. I can imagine how happy your father will be. Come down now and give me a kiss. She kept staring at me, gracefully tilting her head, her lips shaped in her sweetness and her most alluring smile. When I showed no sign of moving from the window, she lamented, "Oh, do you think it's kind to make your mother beg this much for a little kiss?" A short while before, as I was walking through one of the drawing rooms, I had stopped to look at an old silver-framed photograph, which was on top of a small table, along with many other family photos. It portrayed me and my mother in 1918, during the last summer of the war. Skinny as a girl, dressed in white, my mother was kneeling beside me against the background of the vegetable garden of my grandmother's country house at Masitorello, where she and I had gone to stay shortly after my father had left for the front. While she hugged me passionately to her breast, she turned in the direction of the lens an intensely joyous smile, in stark contrast to the severe and scowling expression on my chubby face, framed by long straight hair cut in a fringe. The photo was taken by my father on one of his brief leaves from the front. It was his masterpiece, he often said, and my mother would nod in agreement every time. Yet only a minute ago, I had understood the real meaning of that smile of my mother's, a bride of barely 3 years, what it promised, what it offered, and to whom. I now watched her. My mother was no longer so young, so much a girl, and I felt my heart once again lifting with disgust and rancour. With the rapidity of jump cuts in a film, epic and melancholic visions of storm-beaten, lonely beaches flashed across my mind, of dizzy, unreachable mountain peaks, of virgin forests and deserts. Oh, to be gone from here, to flee, not to see another soul, but most of all, not to be seen by anyone else. So, my mother insisted, do I have to stay here beneath your balcony, begging? Or would His Highness prefer his faithful follower to go all the way upstairs to pay him court? No, I'd come down to her. We would talk. I would let her question me until the moment when my father, having returned home and seeing us, would clap his hands to let us know he was there and was in a hurry to have supper. What would it have cost me to lie for half an hour? I would behave perfectly. Every attempt on her part to sound me out would fail. And if she needed a kiss to deceive herself that I was still a little child, her little child, she would have the kiss she sought. "No, wait," I replied. "I'll come down straight away." Saying this, I withdrew from the windowsill. Chapter 15. The ulcer had begun to fester in secret, slowly, torpidly, irremediably. I was expecting nothing further in the near future. I was neither expecting nor hoping for any explanations whatsoever, not even concerning Luciano. Instead, no, I did see Luciano at Cesenatico a month and a half later, and with that meeting I undoubtedly received an explanation of some kind. One Sunday morning, after a sleepless night spent pacing up and down the few square meters of my little bedroom, I suffered from adolescent acne at that period. I went down to the beach very early and on my own. It must have been 8 o'clock. The vast expanse of sand appeared almost deserted. Stretched out on a deck chair, beside a folded beach parasol, I finally dozed off into a fairly light sleep, as I still seemed able to register, one by one, all the small sounds that prefigured the noisy day at the seaside, which was just beginning. The coming and going of beach attendants, busy setting out tents and parasols, the rhythmic shouts of a group of fishermen drawing their net ashore, but no less restorative for that. And while I was thinking that at around 10 I'd rouse myself and go to visit the tent where the children of the Sassoli family from Bologna were camping, and later I would go with them for the usual very long drawn-out swim, and then there he was, beside me. He was standing there, studying my awakening, his little skeletal body utterly hairless, seeming ever slenderer beside the abnormal swelling of his sex beneath the great trunks. He was smiling at me. "When did you arrive?" I asked without getting up. A flash of joy and gratitude lit up his eyes. So I wasn't going to chase him away. So I'd returned to being the nice person I used to be. "Only about half an hour ago," he replied, with his customary lateral jutting out of the jaw. "Did you come from Ferrara?" "That's right." "But when did you leave?" "When it was still dark," he laughed. "At 4:45, just imagine it, there was a local train, chuff, 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 chuff. It took us almost 4 hours to travel 100 kilometers. The train," he went on, all smiles and contentment, "didn't miss out on a single station en route. It began its stops after only 10 minutes at Galbanella, then Montesanto, and then one after another, Portomaggiore, Argenta, San Biagio, Lavezzola, Voltana, Alfonsine, Glorie, to beach itself at Ravenna, 2/3 of the way through the journey, where it decided to have a rest for a good 35 minutes. After Ravenna," I lifted my hand. "How did you manage to find our villa?" Every now and then my memory does seem to work, he replied with a smile and winked. I remembered the address. That captivating wink, rather than hinting at our intimacy during the last months, meant to reassure me that he hadn't the least intention of reproaching me for anything. Though he did blame me, affectionately, but still he blamed me. You must be hungry, I said. Should I fetch you something to eat? There was no need. My mother, he said, glad to ramble on once more, had already prepared a snack for him. As soon as she'd seen him, she'd kindly taken the trouble to set before him an enormous cup of milky coffee. He'd had the coffee in the dining room, along with my brother and little sister, who had then just got out of bed. But since the two of them wouldn't be coming to the beach before 9, and since he was keen to see me again, he'd hurried along here. Where did you change? In your room, he replied, slightly alarmed. Why? It was your mother who told me I could go in there. At this point, he was sitting beside me on the sand. It was a really beautiful morning. Before us, the water and the sky formed a single brightness. The boats in the distance seemed to be suspended in air. It's such a great place, this, he murmured after a long silence. He turned back towards me for a moment, then, in a serious tone, added that he had come to Cesenatico on purpose to see me and have a talk with me. After being so friendly and kind, I had altered of late and didn't seem the same person. And since his father had finally managed to persuade a friend of his, an old doctor in Bologna, to rent him his medical practice, a circumstance that would force them to leave Ferrara within a month. Before moving elsewhere, he'd felt the pressing need to come and thank me once again, hoping at the same time to dispel all those misunderstandings that might have got between us. And so what did I have to reproach him with? He felt his conscience to be more than clear. In case I'd believed some stupid rumour about him that had been put about by malicious persons unknown, I had only to ask him, and he was ready to answer any question whatsoever. Seated cross-legged like an Indian, he spoke without looking at me. I listened to him. I listened to the hum his words made in that huge expanse of motionless air. He said that he and his family were about to leave Ferrara, that we would never see each other again. Good. Go on, he persisted. First question, fire away. I replied that there was nothing I had to ask him. Not a single thing. He shook his head. Perhaps, he sighed. And yet I feel that you're hiding something, that you're not telling the whole truth. For a while he stayed silent. At last, after another sidelong glance, he asked me how I spent my days at the seaside, and if during that month or more I'd been here, some seductive married lady hadn't assumed the responsibility of helping me lose my virginity. How many lovely and well-disposed ladies there must be in Cesenatico. Coming from the station to our house, he'd been able to ogle quite a few luscious bits, taking a stroll along the avenues. I, with my physique, all I'd need to do was to take a look around. When on holiday, and especially at the seaside, women only think of enjoying themselves. So whoever wants to enjoy himself with women only has to know how to make the best of the opportunities the time and place have offered him. I had been expecting him, sooner or later, to return to his favourite topic. I had thought that from the first moment I spied him through my half-closed eyelids. But the cautious, oddly anxious tone his voice had assumed was something I hadn't foreseen. I replied that I hadn't encountered any married women of that kind, and this time the company I'd been frequenting was all male, headed by some brothers called Sassoli from Bologna. And anyway, if I had sighted any such women, the spots erupting on my face would undoubtedly have stopped me from being taken into consideration. He gave a quick look at my face and once again shook his head. "What a weird idea," he exclaimed happily. "You're strikingly handsome, regardless. In any case," he went on, "should I fail to find anything better out in the streets, I could always, if I wished, have recourse to him." He immediately explained. A few mornings ago in Ferrara, while he was passing down Via Colomba, a black-haired beauty in her dressing gown, leaning out from a first-floor window in the Pensione Mafarca, had greeted him with a big smile, accompanied by a suggestive gesture. They hadn't actually exchanged any words, but he was sure all he needed to do was to introduce himself one morning wearing long trousers. His mother had resisted buying them for him, but within a week he'd be able to persuade her. Better still if he was accompanied by a friend, and she, the dark-haired piece, would let us sample the goods gratis. If the idea appealed, and he stared me in the eyes, I could be that friend. "Couldn't you invent some excuse to make a trip to Ferrara?" He relentlessly pursued the topic. "That woman, you'll see, would not only let us in, but take us up to her bedroom together." I looked away and up at the sky. As on every morning at that time, a military aircraft was flying over, some way out from the coast. In the distance, the silver cockpit of the Savoia Marchetti glinted in the sunlight. How many kilometres out was it from the shore? I reckoned that those 4 fishing vessels far out at sea, motionless on the horizon, must have had the plane overhead. I stretched and yawned. "No," I replied. "First of all, nor do I have any long trousers. And then the idea of a threesome doesn't appeal to me. I'd never do it." "You don't like the idea of a threesome?" he stammered, staring at me, pallid as a drowned man. But I... He added nothing more. He started examining the sand in front of his pointed knees. I too remained silent. Suddenly I stood up. "Would you like to take out a rowing boat?" He lifted his face with an inquiring look. "Yes, sure," he replied, and was already getting to his feet. "But don't forget that I can't swim." Never fear. If it comes to it, I'll save you. I rowed. At some 100 meters from the shore, I spotted my mother, in a skirt and short-sleeved blouse, standing in the doorway of the Adele Baths, having just arrived there from our house. With her right hand she was holding Fanny's hand. With her left hand raised, she was screening her eyes from the sun. Not seeing us under the beach umbrella, she must have quickly surmised that we were in the sea and was trying to work out where. "Ooh," I cried, waving an arm about my hand. "Ooh," she replied. "Ooh." "Who is it? Your mother?" Luciano asked. I didn't reply. I had begun rowing again vigorously, my eyes fixed on my mother, who was already making her way towards our beach cabin. By now she was tiny. In a short while, when she left the cabin wearing her beautiful blue Janssen swimsuit, she would be no more than an indistinguishable speck. When we had gone about 1 kilometre from the beach, I stepped up onto the seat and dived into the water. Left alone on the dipping and rolling boat, at first Luciano was overcome by panic. He gripped the seat, looking around, bewildered. But he soon seemed to calm down, and I was aware that he'd begun to follow my manoeuvres in the water attentively and admiringly. "You look like a motorboat," he said as soon as I'd climbed back aboard. "What do you call that stroke you were doing?" "The crawl." What is it? Does it come from America?" "From Hawaii." "I can believe it," he exclaimed enthusiastically. "Last week I was at the canal by Via d'Arsena to watch a swimming race. No one swam like you, making all that foam with your feet. Is it hard to learn, the crawl?" "Not that hard." I tried to explain to him how you needed to coordinate your feet with your head and arms. "And who taught you how to do it?" he asked when I'd finished. "No one," I replied. In the meantime, I'd started rowing again. "And what now?" Luciano asked in a melancholic tone, realizing that we were once more heading for the open sea. "Aren't we going to turn back?" "With this sea, this calm, it'll be worth the effort to get as far as the nearest fishing boats." I nodded with my chin towards 2 of the 4 fishing vessels that I'd noticed from the shore, and that were not fairly close. "If we were alongside when they draw in their nets," I said, "perhaps they'd give us some fish to make soup with." "But apart from the soup," I added, "don't you see how beautiful it is?" And it was, after all, beautiful. I can hardly remember a sea so calm and so flat. Rather than floating on the water, it seemed that we were flying, gliding slowly through the air. Was that the shore out there opposite? Hazy, with the blue hills behind. I could barely recognize it. Luciano, too, had his head turned towards the distant shore. Silent, shut in his thoughts, he seemed to have forgotten about me. I watched him, and suddenly there, in the fiery, motionless air, I was shaken by a strange, cold shiver. I didn't fully understand. I felt uneasy, suddenly at the edge of things, in some way excluded, and precisely because of that, envious, wretched, and petty. And what if instead I'd spoken my mind to Luciano? I wondered, staring at his thin, lonely back, a little reddened by the sun above his shoulder blades. If I'd been decisive, accepting his recent suggestion, had roughly placed him and myself in front of the truth, the whole truth. Not for an hour yet would the offshore wind begin to make the water choppy. There would be no shortage of time. And yet, in the very moment when facing his sorry, bare back, suddenly distant, unreachable in its solitude, I gave way to these thoughts. Already, then, something was telling me that if Luciano Pulga might be able to accept this encounter with the truth, I would not. Slow to understand, nailed by birth to a destiny of exclusion and resentment, it was useless to think that I would ever be able to throw open the door behind which I was yet again hiding. I just couldn't do it. There was no remedy. Not now. Not ever.